Welcome to our webinar, Top Trends for Hadoop in 2015 with Actyon, Hortonworks, and Forrester. Our agenda today is Top Trends in Hadoop for 2015 with Forrester, Big Data Trends with Hortonworks, and High Performance Analytics at Scale in Hadoop with Actyon. Our presenters today are Mike Gualtieri, Principal Analyst, Forrester, John Kreisa, Vice President, Strategic Marketing at Hortonworks, and Christy Maver, Global Product Marketing Director at Actyon. Let's get started with Mike.
Hi everyone, I'm Mike Gualtieri, Principal Analyst at Forrester, and I do cover big data, Hadoop, and lots of related analytics. And what I want to talk to you about is some of the trends that we're seeing in Hadoop and how that will impact, or how that is impacting analytics right now. The first thing that I'm really excited about is that we're talking about data again. You know, throughout IT history, there's always a hot topic, and clearly data is that hot topic. You can see here in the survey, we surveyed a couple thousand business and technology leaders, and we said, hey, what are your priorities? And clearly the first and second priorities are data-related projects, and you can see some of the usual suspects there, like cloud, mobile. Those are hot as well, but data is number one. And data, of course, runs through all of these other things, so it's related, but the focus is now on data. And the reason for that is analytics. All kinds of analytics, predictive analytics, advanced analytics, plain old traditional analytics. Businesses want more analytics. And they want it to find deeper insights. They have large volumes of data. The data is changing a lot. And you notice how I highlight below that earlier generation technology is too expensive. That's the least important reason, according to our survey. So even though Hadoop is open source, that isn't a primary driver. It's a very interesting driver and perhaps an enabler, but the key desire here by companies is through advanced analytics. And if we take it up a level and we look at the business priorities, you can see grow revenue is number one. I guess everyone wants to grow their revenue. But number two gets to the heart of it, which is to improve the experience of our customers, because there's always a battle for customers, but customers have a lot more choices now in the digital world, and firms need to create better experiences for those customers. So that's the backdrop of why we're talking about analytics and how Hadoop plays in that. Now that bigger customer experience driver, at Forrester we call that the age of the customer, because customers have a lot more options, and it's harder for companies to vie for their loyalties. I net that out, and I just call it royalty. And when we think about what royalty means, is consumers want to be treated like royalty. And that means they don't want to be treated as one of the masses. They want very individualized, contextual services. Okay, if you walk into a restaurant, what do you get? You get the same menu as everyone else. But if you're a royal and you walk in, you're going to get something that's a little more personalized. So no matter who their customer is and no matter what these brands are, they're all striving towards some sort of hyper-personalization in their customer experiences. And that's largely why we're talking about data. But these new customer experiences, these next-gen royalty experiences, they have to have both contextual awareness and they have to adapt to serve a single customer. So not a big old segment of customers, but a particular customer. So take an example here. This is Melissa. She has her wearable. She goes for a morning run for 4 miles. Later that night, walks into the Cheesecake Factory, is handed a tablet menu which recognizes her immediately, digitally displays a menu of her preferences. That app queries the wearable API, downloads the calories. She burned an extra 410 calories, and it displays the Kahlua cheesecake. So that's the sort of very specific, contextual, individualized experience. But to do that, you need to know two things about Melissa. You need to understand the characteristics of what she likes, and you also need to understand what she's doing in real-time context. The net is that if you treat customers with hyper-personalization, there'll be more loyal customers and raving fans to bring in more customers. So one of the reasons why data is hot, especially in this context of hyper-personalized customer experiences, is that to understand people as individuals, you need to know more about them. You know, a friend knows a lot about you because they've had lots of interactions. They have a lot of data about you. And that's what big data is about, at least in the consumer space, to understand the customer's behavior, attitudes, contents. And when I say the customer, I'm talking about the individual, not talking about a segment, okay? Because to treat people like royalty, it's treated as individuals. So, but simply having that data is not enough. You have to do analytics on that data. And analytics is a bit of a loaded word. It means a lot of things. And businesses often think of analytics as a set of historical reports and dashboards. So the typical reporting you might get out of a financial system or a sales system or even a dashboard. And that's reporting on what happened in the business. That's critical. That's important. But analytics is also about the future. It's about anticipation. It's about what's about to happen as well. And that's where there's a gap. It's really important to have all of these kinds of analytics. Not saying the descriptive, the traditional analytics is bad. You need that, right? But you also need analytics in real time to serve customers and business decisions in the present. And you also need predictive analytics. And all of these analytics require data. And the real-time analytics and the predictive analytics especially require more and new data. So the way this nets out is that firms have to have ubiquitous analytics. Analytics, past, present, future, that are completely available to continuously improve customer experience. And going along with that is operational efficiency and some of their decision-making as well. And there's a lot of opportunity. This is a quiz. I know you can't answer, right? But what percentage of enterprise data do firms use for analytics? Probably no surprise, it's only 12%. So the opportunity is vast in terms of just using the data that enterprises have now for analytics. But there's been some challenges in terms of doing those analytics. And that's where Hadoop has really changed the game in terms of a firm and enterprise's ability to analyze and store all of that data. So when you think about Hadoop, it's certainly a cost-effective way to gather and store all of your data. So at a very simple level, Hadoop stores data. And if that's all it did, it would just be another file system, HDFS. But Hadoop is unique in that it can also analyze or process that data. And it's a very general purpose platform, so it can process it in any way. You'll see later, and you probably know, that you can execute SQL against it. You can execute machine learning. So the way to think of Hadoop is that it can store and process data, and it's scalable across a cluster. So I net this out, and I just say that Hadoop is very unique because it's a data operating system. So what we've seen and what we recommend to our clients at Forrester is that Hadoop adoption is not an option. There is a need for every enterprise to adopt Hadoop, and we'll get into some of the reasons why. Now, one of the questions I get asked very frequently is, where you're seeing uptake. What industries are using Hadoop? They're all using it. The data shows that it's across the board. It's a general purpose platform, and this need for analytics is across all industries as well. And one of the drivers here is that all of these industries have more data. And I'm not going to go through all of these data, you can read it, but I'll point out that sensor, event data from IoT devices, and also the data economy, there's more data, and also derived data from analytics. So what do? You're not even analyzing the 12%. You're only analyzing 12% of the data you have, plus you have all of these other rich sources. You've got a problem because you have to analyze this to stay competitive and to create more hyper-personalized experiences. So a couple of use cases. The fraud use case, and this isn't just about rules, but it's about understanding the fraud profile of individual users so you don't get false positives. To do that, you need an enormous amount of data, experiential data, that you're doing learning on over a short and long period of time. Some investment firms, they want to track what equities and stocks are being talked about and what individuals are talking about them, because if they can get an edge by listening to social media, maybe they can buy and sell an equity faster before others find out about it. Healthcare, also a social media use case. The drug's out on the market, but how can you learn more about efficacy, share of voice, and the side effects that weren't caught in the clinical trials? Another use case. A sensor, wearable use case. There's a firm that makes this band that goes around a baby's leg that's monitoring the baby's vital signs so that a mom can be in the other room and be alerted, knowing that everything's fine, or maybe the baby requires some sort of attention. All kinds of use cases here, and there's certain location-based use cases, because remember, a mobile device, that's where you have a lot of information about individual customers. What if you knew these customers were in the particular shopping mall, but you also knew that they just moved to the town? There's a range of very specific and personalized offers that you can make. And a final use case I'll mention is many cable companies, every button you press on that cable remote can go back to the cable company. And they can analyze what buttons are pressed and why, and maybe even predict from the buttons pressed and the channels watched who's watching, who or how many people are watching the particular show, and that can lead to more relevant ads, which is also a service to customers, so they don't have to look at ads that they have no interest in. These are just a few of the use cases. These use cases exist in all industries, and there's some use cases that are being invented that are also reinventing the customer experience and business processes throughout the industry. So let's look at the specific trends for 2015 for Hadoop. Now, the first one is that Hadooponomics makes enterprise adoption mandatory. And what that means is that Hadoop, never before has there been a more cost-effective way to store and process data in a scalable way. Hadoop is open source software. It both stores and processes the data, and it can do it in an economical, general purpose way. So even if you don't have a very complicated use case, the economics make it very attractive, especially in two cases. One, where you're not even storing data. You may not know the value of that data, but you're just not storing it. Okay, store it in Hadoop. You may be storing the data in a enterprise data warehouse, but at a much higher cost than Hadoop. You can put some of those workloads and some of that data in Hadoop, and freeing up space on more expensive platforms. So what we have seen is a barrage of interest in Hadoop over the past 2 years, but the nature of the inquiries have changed, okay? And these are leading indicators for me. So last year, you start having more inquiries about security on Hadoop. You start having more inquiries about cloud, okay? So what does that mean? Well, if Hadoop is experimental, it's largely a cordoned-off experiment within an enterprise. But when it's going to go into production, well, now all of the enterprise architecture mechanisms come in place, including security professionals. And now security matters when you go into production, and governance matters. Cloud, okay? Most Hadoop in enterprises is still on-premise, although there's excellent cloud options out there. CIOs ask when something's going to production, is there a cloud way to do this? So questions like that are leading indicators, and the data also shows incredible adoption for Hadoop, but really becoming a production priority in 2015. Now, the second trend is a little bit odd, or some of you may think it's odd, right? Because when Hadoop first came out and the talk about big data, it was largely about unstructured data. And I still get inquiries today where people are saying, well, yeah, we want to put our unstructured data in Hadoop. Well, remember what I said? Hadoop is general purpose. HDFS, the Hadoop file system, it doesn't care if the data is structured, unstructured. It's a file system, okay? And when you go back to that figure that enterprises are only analyzing about 12% of their information, a lot of that is structured. So the low-hanging fruit for Hadoop has become analyzing structured information. And the most popular and easy way to do that is through SQL. So we've seen a lot of SQL engines start to emerge, both commercial and in the open source community, and these SQL engines are getting good. They're getting real good, okay? They may not be, many of them, especially in the open source, may not be to the level of compliance of SQL, but the commercial companies have taken their SQL technology and repurposed it for Hadoop. So, you talk about adoption. This is one of the easiest use cases because it means, all right, we have all this data, we want to analyze it, and we want to use SQL. The enterprise has people who know SQL, and they have lots of structured data that they have not been analyzing. So we're going to see SQL become even more important and become a lone reason in many enterprises why they adopt it. Now, for it to get really adopted, it needs to be extremely fast, ANSI compliant. It has to be optimized for Hadoop, and there's many commercial offers now that do this for Hadoop. So the third one is that enterprise software vendors close Hadoop's data management and governance gaps. Once you start putting data in Hadoop, it's fun, it's easy. You can do it without any governance and any security, and in fact many firms do because it's experimental. But once you start putting this into production, you're going to need things like security solutions. You're going to need things like data modeling and data governance. And many of the open source projects that are emerging are great for this, but they are emerging, right? And there's many commercial vendors that have been doing this for many, many years. So, and the other problem with the open source solutions is that they're Hadoop-centric, right? So if you want a data management solution that works across your existing databases and Hadoop, well, the Hadoop open source projects aren't going to do that. So for that reason, we think that the commercial vendors are going to start to fill those gaps a lot faster than the open source community. Now, having said that, in many cases, those projects those open source projects will make it easier for the commercial vendors to implement their solutions on top of Hadoop. So if you're looking for governance solutions, if you're looking for security solutions, sure, look at the open source offers that are emerging, but talk to your existing enterprise vendors and see what solutions they have as well. Now, the fourth trend that I see, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, and they say, Mike, you're crazy. One of the most cited issues with Hadoop is a skill shortage. Well, I have two arguments why that's not a problem. Okay, one is if you're doing a SQL workload, well, SQL is not there's no shortage of skills there, right? And so that's a very easy way to use Hadoop without a skills problem. The second thing I say is stop wimping out, okay? Hadoop has map-reduced jobs, and people say they're complex. Well, the people who say they're complex, they're not Java programmers. Most enterprises have Java developers, and they can learn these frameworks. They learn frameworks all the time. Now, they may have to learn how to do it in a distributed architecture, but we're seeing that developers are really interested in this. They're learning about it. There's lots of education programs, and we're not seeing a skill shortage as a barrier to adoption. So that's the key. It's not a barrier to adoption. And as you see commercial vendors, there's more predictive analytics tools out there that work with Hadoop. So you want to do some machine learning? You want to create a recommendation engine? You can take Apache Mahout and a Java programmer, and they can do a recommendation engine. They can program one using the Apache Mahout library. I did it myself in a Saturday afternoon with a public domain data set. It's not that tough. As I mentioned before, Sequel, that's already a ubiquitous solution. And a lot of existing business intelligence tools and other predictive analytics tools are working on Hadoop. So you want to do that same recommendation engine, you can use something like an Alpine Data Labs, and that has a completely visual interface, and it will work with Hadoop. So the skill shortage is disappearing. Now, I mentioned before that one of the leading indicators for a new platform is when people start asking about cloud. Now, to be sure, native cloud companies already use Hadoop in the cloud. There are many companies you've heard of them all: Netflix, Yelp, etc. I mean, Hadoop started on the internet, and all of those companies have adopted it. But now enterprises are asking the cloud question, and that's an indicator that they now want to do some of these workloads in the cloud. And Hadoop's perfect for it, right? Because Hadoop stores data and it processes data, but it doesn't always do that at the same time. And so it's very elastic in nature. So we're going to see enterprises do things on-prem, but increasingly do stuff in the cloud as the cloud natives have already done. The other point here is that data often originates in the cloud. Mobile data, web data, it's already there. So it makes sense to use Hadoop in the cloud. Now, one of the most exciting trends is that Hadoop isn't just for analytics anymore. I've talked to dozens of companies where Hadoop isn't this offline analytics platform for exploring data. It's actually part of the application. Ad tech companies, cable companies, finance companies, telecom companies, retail companies. Hadoop becomes part of an application. It's serving that application in real time with some of the insights it has. It might be HBase running on Hadoop, but remember what I said about Hadoop? It's general purpose. It stores and processes data. So it can be used as an application platform or part of the application architecture. And that's one of the most significant trends that's going to lead to Hadoop really going mainstream and being used to build some of these cool new customer experiences that I talked about in the beginning. And then finally, the other thing that we're seeing is that the Hadoop ecosystem is starting to standardize. Now, one of the most wonderful, beautiful things about the open source community is that innovation happens organically. And that's where you get great projects such as Hadoop and the other sub-projects that grow up around it. But often what happens is you get lots of competing projects as well. And enterprises can often be confused about which technologies to use. What should their complete distribution look like? Now, the commercial Hadoop distros, Hortonworks, Cloudera, MapR, and a couple of others, they have distros where they package all of this up. But often, there's different open source projects in each one of them, right? So as the community starts to develop and enterprises start to use this, we're starting to see some standardization. There'll be standards over what management platforms to use, what governance platforms to use, how certain internals work, what APIs. Recently, a number of companies, 15 companies, formed something called the Open Data Platform. And that's a bunch of companies that are trying to come up with one particular standard. It won't be the only standard, but it will simplify an enterprise's ability to understand what their complete distribution should look like. So enterprises, when they build applications, when they build analytics on top of Hadoop, they have to know that they're portable across whatever distro, and that's particularly important when you think about wanting to move workloads to the cloud, which we know they're going to want to do. So there's an enormous opportunity for Hadoop, not just in storing data, big data, but in becoming part of an enterprise's core application platform. And the customers are ready. They are ready for these more personalized experiences, using the big data to learn more about them and to create these experiences. And all you have to do is think about, in your own company, two things. One, take your 3 or 4 most challenging business processes that you have today and walk through them. Just whiteboard through the steps in those processes and ask yourself a question. Is there any analytics along this step that could potentially make this process smoother, bypass it, or maybe even re-engineer the process using analytics? And there you go. You'll probably come up with 6 or 7 ideas, and there are 6 or 7 ideas that you can take and try to implement with Hadoop. The second thing, with the customer experience, take your customer journey. Walk through each step of the customer journey. Ask yourself the same question. Is there any analytics, predictive, streaming, or historical analytics I can use at any step of this application that will enrich the experience for that customer or make it more personal? Again, you're going to come up with a handful of ideas and that you can go experiment and try to implement those. Now, the way to think of this when you come up with those ideas is now you've become like a venture capitalist. Because what does a venture capitalist do? They invest in 10 companies expecting 2 of them to succeed. But those 2 will succeed fabulously. Those are the type of big ideas you need, and you need to bring to the business. And Hadoop will play a big part in that, along with all of the analytics that you're going to need to do it. So with that, I will turn this over now to John Kreisa. John?
Thanks a bunch, Mike. Really appreciate it. Great insight into some of the drivers, and I would say, as one of the vendors at the core of the Hadoop movement, I would agree with the trends that you've laid out. So what I want to do actually is pick up where you left off, really, and talk about how we see Hadoop being adopted, being driven into, and what some of the use cases are for this technology. Hopefully that will give everybody an idea of kind of where we see the technology going, where we see and how we see organizations using the technology, and give you an idea of how you might get started or where your journey with Hadoop might ultimately end. So really picking up with what you said in terms of the data, and you talk quite a bit about it. We definitely see data as a driver for Hadoop adoption, along the lines of some of the things you talked about, but really around the kind of scale of data, whether it's structured or unstructured, but a lot of it driven by unstructured. This new kinds of data have put the traditional systems that most organizations have out there under a tremendous amount of pressure in terms of loading the data, handling the scale that these new data types come at. And when I say new data, what I mean by that is a lot of the data types that Mike laid out. Clickstream data, geolocation, web data, and really the machine-generated data is a huge driver for why organizations are turning to this open source, highly scalable technology to solve some of these problems from storage and analytics standpoint. Of course, we'll hear in a minute on how Actyon really enhances the analytic capability that's inherently available inside of Hadoop. But the sort of quote-unquote new data types, not necessarily new because they've been around for a while, but newly exploitable. And it's really for the corporations and organizations that are looking to get ahead, to create a competitive advantage. And kudos to those who are on the webinar today, because clearly you're starting to think about these kind of new techniques and how you can take advantage of these new data types. And you may be in this situation as well, where you're starting to think, hey, what do I need to do to create some more advantage? And as you said, Mike, there's was cost optimization as one of the principal drivers. You're seeing more kind of new business opportunities, and we definitely agree with that. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in just a moment. So really, just to kind of also level set, and we're a little bit into the webinar here, but Hadoop has emerged as that foundation for the new data architecture. And as Mike said, it's open source technology. It comes out of the big web properties, and is now 10 years old. So the technology has continued to mature to the point where many organizations are seeing new ways to get data out of it. But this technology is one that we see continuing to grow and continuing to provide more value, particularly through the integration as such that we have with Actyon and through other analytic tools. So there was a question on the webinar, and I want to remind everybody that you can definitely continue to ask questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll leave plenty of time to address those at the end. But where does Hadoop fit in the overall architecture of an enterprise? How should you think about it? It actually should sit there and complement your existing technology. Hadoop enhances what you can already do with those systems that you might already be using, and it has to do it in a deeply integrated way. It's one of the things that we at Hortonworks spend a lot of time on, is working with our partners like Actyon, developing and integrating these technologies deeply into this platform so that you can get more value out of the data that you can now capture, process, and analyze at scale. So Hadoop itself complements the existing systems that you have. Technologies like Actyon deeply integrated on top of that give you even more value, allow you to extract the value from those data sources that you're putting in there. So as I said, we work very closely, Actyon, to work with them in what we would call a modern data architecture. This is a relatively simplified diagram, but it just shows how new technologies and how technologies can be integrated into this. Specifically with regards to Actyon, integrated deeply into what we call the data operating system for Hadoop called Yarn. And what that does is it allows it to interoperate and act as a first-class citizen within the cluster from a resource standpoint, allowing it to scale out across all of the data that's been deployed into Hadoop, stored in HDFS, along with the other workloads that you might have, the batch and interactive and streaming workloads. At the same time, can use tools from Actyon to continue to process that. So ultimately, it ends up being this modern data architecture where you're capturing this data and analyzing and drawing out more value, integrated in a way that also allows you to utilize the other systems. So I just want to kind of help everybody understand that. And Mike talked about the skills as well. Because of the skill sets are very prevalent around, again, tools, SQL, and Actyon has that kind of interface that would allow you to more readily use this technology out there and get more of your users up and running on this new technology, taking advantage of the new data types more quickly. So ultimately helps you deliver value more quickly by allowing you to leverage the existing skill sets you have within your organization. So, just talk a little bit about the drivers. One is cost optimization. There still is one of the top reasons we see Hadoop being adopted. It's to drive some additional costs out of the business, often around the EDW, really allowing you to capture more value within the EDW. And what are some of the use cases? One is just archiving, just taking old and cold data out of the EDW, but keeping it online where you can continue to analyze it. Offloading different kinds of transformational workloads, ETL processing. They're often low value, just pure transformational. I'm moving tables around, or I'm changing column headers, or just transforming data in some relatively low value, simplified way. still commonly done inside the warehouse, that's something that can be much more cost effectively done, particularly at scale inside of a Hadoop infrastructure. But ultimately that data can get loaded back into, into a warehouse as needed once you find the kind of more gold nuggets so that you can use it on the high-speed analytic multi-tenant way that you might use it inside of your data warehouse. So definitely a symbiotic relationship, but allowing you to drive some costs out of the business into the Hadoop infrastructure. So the other side of the coin of that is making money, and that's new and advanced analytic applications. So the converse, and to Mike's point about looking for new revenue opportunities, we also see advanced analytic applications getting built off of the platform and using those across industries. Mike talked about how it's very, very broad adoption. We completely agree with that. We see Hadoop adoption across really every industry. And interestingly enough, you can map those to a couple of pretty simplified use cases. So one would be getting a single view of a customer or a single view of operations across the business. And so you can get a single view of those things by unifying the data in one common platform. Secondly, there's also predictive. So how do I get more proactive and predictive about the business? Again, more proactive and predictive about customer behavior, proactive and predictive about my manufacturing, looking for failures or problems within my manufacturing chain. Healthcare, being more proactive and predictive about, outbreaks that I might have within the healthcare system or other, patient-related needs. So you can see there's like a common pattern, single view, predictive analytics, and then finally data discovery, just going in and trolling through very large amounts of data with machine learning tools and other kinds of tools that allow you to find patterns within that data that would help you find new kinds of business opportunities. But cost optimization and advanced analytics, the two sides of the coin of how we see Hadoop being used within organizations. Ultimately, what that means and what the journey that you might find yourself on today is one towards a data lake. And they always start with one of those two use cases, cost optimization or creating a new advanced analytic application. Excuse me. And the journey that we see customers on grows out in scale or out in scope. So they're either adding in just more of the same kind of data, capturing streaming data, machine-generated systems, IoT-type data, or it'll grow out in scope, meaning I'm adding in more workloads. I might add in addition to some batch processing I'm doing for transformational workloads, I might add in an Actyon so that I can do more high-speed advanced analytics on top of that data and other kinds of workloads. So ultimately that leads to a data lake, a centralized architecture driven by the business that allows any of my applications that are running to access the true value, full value of all that data that I've captured at the lowest level of detail. So that's the journey, but it always starts with one of those optimization or advanced analytic applications. We also recommend it starts small in scale, small in scope. Just pick one application or one cost optimization driver to work around. That's what we see in terms of driving the ultimate success with this technology. A good example of that is one of our customers, TrueCar, who just really over a fairly short period of time found the technology, adopted it, and started to put it in production. There was some key values that they got out of this. One of those is multiple applications that they're running, sitting on top of Hadoop, the ability to capture nearly 2 petabytes of data and use and analyze all the data. So a tremendous amount of data that can be captured. And they're also able to substantially reduce the cost of storage on that from about $19 per gigabyte down to 23 cents per gigabyte, so substantial. You can see the timeline of adoption there, fairly quickly starting in June of 2013, moving out through August, beginning to get some training and development, starting to work with the technology, and then deploying nodes and clusters. So the first 3 apps went within 6 months into production in December of 2013. Then they begin to grow the staff working on the technology. February, 3 more apps, giving them 6. So multiple applications leveraging all of this huge pool of data, allowing them to drive drive the business forward, analyzing all the data that TrueCar captures. If you're familiar, they do car ratings and buying services for both dealers and now to the end user. So a tremendous amount of data interacting with users through the web. So a great use case there that kind of shows that the analytic application, new business use case. So just in terms of what you can do with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Christy. If you want to go learn more about our partnership with Actyon, you can certainly do that at our website. If you want to get your hands on the technology and experience it, there's a sandbox which allows you to, it's the fastest way to learn Hadoop. It's got built-in tutorials that allow you to go kind of 101, 201, 301 level experience. And this is something that you can learn more. There's also a Hadoop Summit, which is coming up, one in April in Belgium and one in June in San Jose, California. So let me turn it over to Christy to tell you more about high-performance analytics at scale.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And thank you, Mike, too. This is great content. It's nice to hear the Hadoop trends from both of you, from Mike, and then to hear them confirmed from you, John. And it really reinforces what we're seeing as well from the Actyon perspective. We're seeing projects move from experimentation, from a POC to production. We're seeing adoption across industries, and we're really seeing Hadoop emerge, as John said, as the foundation of this new modern data architecture. And Hadoop is here to stay. There's no question about it. And some interesting things are happening as organizations have become more comfortable with this fact. So Mike talked about Sequel as the killer app, and we certainly have seen many Sequel on Hadoop capabilities emerge. And I want to talk for a little bit about some characteristics that we think have become requirements for a Sequel in Hadoop solution. And the first thing is it has to be open. We're getting clear indication from our customers that open is a requirement. And the reason why is nobody wants to be locked into one specific vendor. And when we talk about open is kind of a funny word because there's openness, and then there's open source. So when we talk about open, we're talking about being able to have a choice, giving customers the choice to own their data and be able to decide where and how they want to keep it, being able to work with different file formats, whether it's Parquet, so that customers have a choice with what they want to do with their data, where they want to put it. Being able to be consistent. When you have a SQL and Hadoop solution, it has to live within the ecosystem. It can't be something that requires a rip and replace. It has to be something that can play nicely within the Hadoop and Apache ecosystem and support Yarn natively. And this is what we mean when we talk about openness, this collaborative architecture, something that's not going to lock you in. Now, this is very different from open source, which is largely a business model decision from vendors that contribute code to the community. But when you think about it, being open source doesn't necessarily mean it's open. And what we see customers looking for is this open, collaborative architecture. So that's one thing that organizations are looking for when it comes to SQL and Hadoop. The second thing is speed. I mean, let's face it, performance matters. Whether it's on the data ingestion side, data preparation, you need to have fast ingestion, fast analytic engines, and you need to bring this speed to Hadoop, which Hadoop itself is not really known for its speed. But in some of the use cases that Mike shared in the beginning and that John shared as well, when you need results, oftentimes there's a very narrow window of opportunity, and if you miss that window, obviously you miss the opportunity. So speed definitely matters. And then enterprise grade. Now that we've progressed beyond the discussion around Hadoop as an infrastructure layer and Hadoop from a technology perspective, we're really starting to look at Hadoop more from a business perspective. And we're seeing companies start to focus on more of the applications with Hadoop, more of the tooling around Hadoop. And as you move up the stack, some real challenges emerge. And Mike and John both highlighted them, whether it's, performance, but not just performance, with security, for example. Customers want and expect the same technology advantages that they know from the data warehouse side, and they need those advantages applied in this newer, Hadoop technology world. And there are certainly point solutions that can address these gaps, as Mike was saying, but if they're not open, if they're not super performant, then you might actually be solving one problem while you're creating another. So these three things are really the key that when we go out and we talk to our customers, looking for open, fast, and enterprise grade. That's key when you're looking at your SQL and Hadoop solutions. And what this means from an Actyon perspective is we have a solution called Actyon Vortex, which is high-performance analytics at scale in Hadoop. We built it from the ground up to provide the analytics at scale in Hadoop. And it's based on our vector database engine, which was written to really take advantage of performance features in modern CPUs. So what it does is it brings this unbridled processing power to the data nodes in a Hadoop cluster. And you can see on the diagram, I won't go into every detail on the diagram, but you can see what we've done is we've taken the vector database and we've actually put it inside of Hadoop. So we're no longer talking about SQL on Hadoop. We're actually talking about SQL in Hadoop. And this is what gives users the ability to query data directly in Hadoop. It's actually sitting, a piece of the code is actually sitting on each of the data nodes within Hadoop. And there are several optimizations that have been introduced in the last decade that are typically not leveraged by most database software, whether it's SIMD instructions, larger chip caches. There's a list of technology advantages that have really come along in the past 10 years. And when you think about it, most of today's database software was written, in the 70s or 80s, 30, 40 years ago. Has become so complex that in order to take advantage of these modern performance features, with that type of software, a complete rewrite of the database would be required. So with Actyon Vortex, you're getting that, again, proven technology advantage that has been established on the database side, now running right into Hadoop. So now you can plug in any SQL tool, any BI tool, anything you're doing in SQL, basically now you can do directly in Hadoop. And there are certainly many SQL on Hadoop offerings, and even beyond that, we kind of look at it in three different ways. There's SQL outside of Hadoop, there's SQL alongside Hadoop, there's SQL on Hadoop, but we're really excited talking about SQL in Hadoop. So what are some of the things that make Actyon Vortex unique? You can see some of them here on the slide. When we talk about SQL support, and this is an important notion. Mike clearly stated SQL, the killer app for 2015, but not all SQL solutions are alike. You have to have that full ANSI SQL 92 support, the full support that allows you to use all of your BI tools, all of your applications, and that's what's going to give you the maximum transfer of skills, really, and help address that skills shortage, skills gap that we see closing. ACID compliance. This is something that's very unique to a SQL and Hadoop solution. Getting transactional integrity, the same transactional integrity that you'd expect, again, on the database side, now in Hadoop to prevent inaccurate results. Update capabilities, trickle updates. One of the biggest challenges with Hadoop and with HDFS is that it's really not designed for incremental updates. So with Vortex, you get the ability to update individual records with really low impact on read performance. And we actually see others kind of mimicking this approach in Hadoop by implementing other solutions that try to keep track of the updates, and they use disk instead of memory. And what happens there is these approaches become really slow, and that's often why they're switched off by default. So what we've done with Vortex is we've addressed this using a patented high-performance in-memory positional delta tree. And this is used to store those small incremental changes, maybe inserts that are not necessarily appends, as well as updates and deletes. So now, again, you get that high performance. You can make updates on the fly without impacting your performance. Native DBMS security, the ability to get security, whether it's user-based, role-based, data protection, columnar encryption. As John mentioned, native in Hadoop Yarn, being able to manage your Hadoop resources automatically using Yarn, which stands for yet another resource negotiator, so that you're preventing those inefficiencies. And then I mentioned the open collaborative architecture, the ability to query those native Hadoop file formats, even without having to ingest them, and then opening up our APIs so that other third parties and your entire ecosystem can gain access to Actyon's format as well. So these are some of the things that we think make Actyon Vortex unique. And really it's an exciting time to be looking at the Hadoop space and helping customers address their use cases and really get the maximum value out of Hadoop. And so with that, I'm going to open it up. We have, looks like 7 minutes or so for questions. And I know I've seen some questions come in on the chat window. So I'm going to I'm going to try to answer, well, not me personally, John and Mike and I will try to answer as many of the questions that come in. And if we don't have time to get to all the questions, we'll make sure to get to you by email. But let me start with one for John. There's a question came in from Paul that said, is there an emerging or accepted best practice for backing up large data sets that accumulate within an HDFS installation? Do you want to take that one, John?
Yeah, thanks, Christy, and thanks for a great presentation there. So, you know, there's not really I'd say an emerging best practice per se for backing. I mean, Hadoop currently is acting as an online warm storage, if you will, for systems of record today. It's got you know, built-in redundancy. If you're familiar enough with HDFS, it sounds like you are, given the question. So it has the built-in redundancy. So, you know, if somebody's needing to move data off of a Hadoop system, and Hadoop's being used to offload, you know, data from other systems, we mostly are seeing it as the online system of record, and then they might just go to tape or some other really cold, truly cold storage system. That'd be one. The other thing that we are seeing a little bit of an emerging best practice for is moving it to a cloud-based storage system. So moving it off-premise into a cloud-based, you know, blob store, either up in you know, in a Microsoft Azure blob store or you know, or other web-based or cloud-based storage systems. Like Amazon, for example. So, you know, there'd be two. One would be just straight off the tape, and one would be into a cloud-based system.
Great, thanks, John. Mike, I'm going to direct this next one to you. Randy asks, when you talk about Hadoop, does that include all of the Apache projects like Spark, Impala, et cetera? Maybe a little insight into the term Hadoop and how broadly we're using that.
Well, I mean, there's usually people refer to core Hadoop as HDFS, the file system, MapReduce and Yarn, and maybe a few other projects. I mean, there's a lot of other projects around Hadoop. There's Hive, there's Flume, there's many other projects that work in that ecosystem, and enterprises have to make choices about which of those sub-projects to use. Now, the commercial distros package a lot of these, they pre-package Hadoop with a lot of these additional projects. You mentioned Spark. Spark is really a separate project. It can run on top of Hadoop, and many of the distros include it in there because many enterprises will find it useful. So it's a little complicated, but if you think of Hadoop as HDFS, MapReduce, Yarn, John, you can probably, maybe you want to add a couple of other projects that you consider the core, but that's really how it plays out.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll comment briefly. I'd just say you're right, Mark. Mike, there's the core Apache Hadoop projects, but each of the commercial distros package a separate, somewhat overlapping set of core open source projects. Some add their own proprietary technology in, frankly, but except for Hortonworks, to make what we'd call an enterprise-grade platform for consuming the tech, all designed to make it easier to consume and use. That's the ultimate goal.
Great. Okay, John has a question around the skills gap, and I'll let either of you, maybe Mike, you might want to start with this since you talked about it. So when you talk about the skills gap closing, what are you seeing new skills coming up in the next generation that's working with Hadoop and software? Do you see this continued focus on SQL? What are some of the new skills that you see, if you see any coming up in the market?
Yeah, well SQL's an existing skill that can be applied to Hadoop immediately. That's not going to change. Then the other skills necessary are to manage the cluster. These clusters can get quite big. I talk to enterprises that have 1,800 nodes, and there's enterprises that have more. There's some that have 10 nodes. So there's a whole operations aspect of Hadoop, as there is with any other platform. What's happening, though, is that Hadoop has gone, so just speaking about the operations side of it, Hadoop's gone from managing clusters at the command line to having visual tools where you can set alerts and manage it. So Bari is one of those. Cloudera has Cloudera Manager. So you're seeing the tools grow up in all aspects. And the other thing I mentioned in my presentation was that there's a lot of commercial vendors. So if you want to do predictive analytics, which in my mind is a beautiful use case for Hadoop, I gave you the example of how you could program in Java. If you have Java skills, you can figure that out. But there's also many commercial predictive analytics tools that now work and can analyze the data in Hadoop without you having to know the internals of Hadoop. So that's what's happening in the whole open source ecosystem and the commercial ecosystem, is that the same higher level tools that enterprises know, love, and are used to using in their other platforms are growing up in the Hadoop ecosystem as well.
Great, thank you. Did you want to add to that, John?
No, it's actually nothing to add there. Sorry. Go ahead, Kristen.
Okay, no, that's fine. I thought you were chiming in. Karsten asks, what about Cassandra, MongoDB, etc.? These tools all promise handling of big data. Will they coexist with Hadoop, or will Hadoop dominate the big data space for the next 10 years? What's the prediction there? I'll let either of you take that one.
You want me to go first, Mike, and then you can jump in?
Sure.
Yep. So, those technologies, in many cases, also connect to Hadoop. Use, in some cases, Hadoop as an HDFS and can use HDFS as the backing store. So, I would say that they're going to still continue to complement. Yes, they do handle big data. They are, in many cases, particularly if you look at something like MongoDB, built for slightly different workloads than maybe just core Hadoop. And the way we would look at it anyway from the standpoint of Hortonworks is, Yarn provides the architecture and infrastructure for them to plug in to Hadoop and run alongside of the other workloads. So, we see it as a complementary situation and one where the right tool can be used for the appropriate workload.
Yeah, this is Mike. I would agree that they're complementary at this point. And I would say the main difference between the workloads right now is that MongoDB is more for transactional type of workloads, whereas Hadoop is more for analytical right now. Same with Cassandra to an extent. I will say this, however, though, that how many clusters is an enterprise going to need, right? So all of these technologies mentioned here, and we could throw Elasticsearch in there as well, which is a a cluster-based search technology. That's an awful lot of clusters. I think what we're going to see as the years progress and the innovation progresses is that maybe some of these transactional and analytical workloads can converge onto a single cluster. And we're seeing some evidence of that already. As John pointed out, Mongo and Cassandra, they can connect to Hadoop. I'd like to see one cluster, one multi-purpose cluster. And you know what? Spark is sort of an interesting example there, right? Because Apache Spark is its own cluster computing platform in its own right. It does not require Hadoop. It's often associated with Hadoop because it makes sense to run Apache Spark on top of Hadoop. And really what that means is that Apache Spark and Hadoop, Apache Spark is co-located on the same nodes. And that makes a lot of sense because the data, much of the data is in HDFS. And that way a Spark cluster wouldn't have to do a hop. It's just right there. To me, that makes sense for transactional data as well. So I guess, what I'm saying is that these platforms all have a very specific purpose. And I talk to enterprises all the time that are using Mongo or Cassandra for transactional and Hadoop for analytics. But I do see Hadoop becoming an application platform. And I think we'll start to see some very competitive transactional NoSQL type databases on Hadoop.
Great. Thank you both. So I know we are a few minutes over, and we still have a list of questions in the chat window that we're not going to be able to get to here live, but we will respond via email to all of the questions. I just want to be respectful of everyone's time and thank everyone for joining. I want to thank Mike and John for presenting and for the fabulous content. And thank everyone else for joining us as well. So, and please feel free to download Actyon Vortex Express. It's a free version that you can try out. We are doing a drawing also for Bose noise-canceling headphones, and you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the recording. I know several of you have been asking about that. So you will get that follow-up email that will have a link to the recording, and as you're listening to it or even after the, after the webinar, feel free to send us any questions. And join us on the Hortonworks Roadshow. You can find out more in the link there. So thank you, everyone, for your time. Thanks again, Mike and John, and have a great rest of your day.